today about what we have seen out there on the road. We often get a lot of feedback from many of our clients, our organizations, our customers in general, about some of the top problems that they're facing many times with their identity and government administration products and or processes. It's often the case also that customers, or at least organizations generally, don't have the opportunity to really almost compare notes, right, across the board to see what are the things that are affecting them. And they're often curious about what are those things and maybe how potentially other organizations or how generally the industry is actually addressing some of the problems that we're going to talk to here. Just a few moments of housekeeping pieces here also. We're going to, or all of the attendees right now will be muted. Feel free to address or at least send in any of your questions via the chat room. We'll be having a question and answer session at the very end of this, where we'll address those questions accordingly. So without further ado, let's get into these problems. These challenges that face most organizations, and by the way, these are by no means the only challenges that are facing organizations when it has to do with identity and governance administration, but these are the ones that seem to always bubble up to the top, right? The ones that are really, really presenting a lot of challenges to most organizations across the board, and continue to be something that generally the industry is still addressing at this point. And so what we'd like to share is not only what those problems are, but some of what we feel are some of the solutions and at least some of the processes that can start being implemented across the board in many organizations to address these problems. Let's go ahead and jump into and share with you what these problems are. And let me advance this slide. Okay, so the first of these problems really has to do with what we consider to be visibility into access. And of course, when we talk about IGA, what we're talking about is really managing the life cycle of an employee, from the day that they walk in the door to the day that they leave, and everything that happens in between, right? Whatever roles they may change or whatever jobs they're actually performing within an organization continually change during that life cycle. And of course, the question becomes, do these employees really have the right access to what they need within the organization? And are those accesses also, as they're changing, are you actually both turning on the right accesses and turning off the previous ones? Because there are always concerns about, generally about security with accesses that are being left open. So I think as we hear this, most customers will tell us, look, typically the longer you're with an organization, the more accesses you accumulate. And it's always an open door policy, right? There's kind of, generally speaking, more of the attitude of we're more willing to grant more accesses to make sure that people are empowered to do what they need to do. But it becomes more difficult to actually remove those accesses as you're moving forward and changing titles within an organization. So we're going to talk a little bit about what some of the ways that you can actually, address these sorts of issues. The second of these, and there's no other better way to put this, and this was actually shared with us with clients directly, which is how exactly do you manage third-party users? And this was a quote that actually came to us from a client directly, which is it's really a Wild West when you're managing contractors. Generally speaking, when you're talking about third-party user management, you're talking about people that are affiliated with the organization, but aren't necessarily part of the organization proper. So, and as such, aren't necessarily present within the systems that actually are typically used to manage these the IGA portion of things. So we'll talk a little bit about that also. And then last but not least is the portion when it has to do with regulation and many industries that are regulated, or simply put, or many industries that are security minded are running certification accesses, right? These are cycles of verifying that employees have the right entitlements and managers performing these reviews to ensure that there is congruity across the board with everyone's entitlements within particular roles. But to do these reviews of these accesses, it's incredibly time consuming. So what the big challenge here is, how do we make this more manageable for managers to be able to do over the period of time, and basically not only ensure that they're being performed, but also being performed correctly, right? What we often hear is the adage, if I have to do so many reviews at this point, and I don't have time to do this, what I'm going to end up doing is basically rubber stamping this and just kicking it through, which inherently makes organizations less secure. So let's take a look first into the first of these problems, which is really visibility into access. And I think most people and most organizations already know that as an employee spends time with the company, you will have a growth of entitlements that these users will have. And of course, when we interview many of our clients, we're talking, anywhere between 50 to 100 to 150 entitlements per employee that you're talking. So obviously this becomes a pretty big problem when you're talking about tens of thousands of employees in some organizations. And then how do you manage this? How do you exactly do you review this? And of course, the idea within the industry was always, the easiest way to do this is obviously take all of these entitlements, group them into groupings that we will call roles, and actually assign roles to users. And then an interesting thing happened. We started talking to some clients also, and many times you would have the management of the roles themselves became a challenge. And, we actually had some clients that would have, let's say, 500 users, and all of a sudden their systems are actually running into 1,000 plus roles, which absolutely doesn't make sense, right? So the ability to actually institute a role-based access control and actually manage these roles correctly has become a huge challenge within the industry. And of course, this visibility into it and the continuous governance behind it is one of the major challenges that everyone is facing. So how is it that roles typically are actually created in organizations? Well, there's usually I'll just address this entitlement creep. How exactly do you manage it? Well, you'll try to do this by actually getting, the correct roles created. And to do this, most organizations will go ahead and kind of do maybe some variant of what you're about to see here, which is, let's take a look at the users that are already employed within our organization and look at these users within certain departments. And if there is a certain match within these users and, in terms of the entitlements that they possess, then when a new user comes in, then obviously we will try to take at least what is kind of like a golden standard, right, from what we believe to be the golden standard from pre-existing employees, and actually start assigning assigning those new users to those roles. This typically is what we see, the feedback that we get across the board. There are some challenges inherent to that, of course, and that's they fall into the categories of what we're seeing here on the right, which is, how exactly do we really know that user one and user two within a specific department? How do we know that these people actually have the correct entitlements to perform the particular tasks at hand? These users at this point may have been with the company for a series of time, but we have no idea whether or not they potentially have a series of entitlements that are associated with roles that they used to have and that basically would never decommission from. So the starting roles, do we know that these are right? Do we know whether or not these users are over or under provisioned? And many times, we often address the over provisioning problem as, you no longer have a particular role within the company, so you need to actually be able to take away some of those extra provisioning options. But the under provisioning is just as important and very, very dangerous also, in the sense that if users are actually part of the same role and one user is under provision from the other, the question becomes, how exactly is this user performing his or her responsibilities within the company if they don't have access to a particular system? Could there be potentially sharing of credentials of these entitlements within employees, which of course it poses a security risk also? So these are kind of the issues that you'll get. And so what we, generally speaking, the best way to kind of handle this is start really looking across and have the way to actually start clustering together what we deem to be what are the responsibilities that actually fall into a particular role, and then be able to sift out what we believe to be the outliers of those core responsibilities in the role itself. So the creation of the role at this point, at least getting a tighter control over that role creation, is really how you can then, when the new user comes in, you have the ability then to assign them this role and actually have pretty good assurance that the role is the correct one and they have the entitlements they need to get. So at least when we started looking at this problem here at Core Securities, we started looking at, well, the best possible way of potentially doing this is having the most amount of visibility that you can possibly get into all the entitlements that exist. And in addition, cluster together what are the things that are alike. So what we've kind of centered on was an approach that basically takes what we call visual grouping, which is creating a system that allows the automatic grouping of like entitlements, seeing how exactly, when we're looking at our user base as a whole, how exactly what are similar between them and what's different. So in this case, having a series of users here and seeing what their entitlements are like, this gives us more power to create a more useful role, and then being able to have visibility into these outlier entitlements. So I have with me also Mike Lynch that has right now a system up and running to show you a little bit of this. Mike, what is it typically that you see happening in some organizations, or at least how is it that they kind of use this sort of system to actually create effective roles?
Yeah, so I mean, typically what you'll see with a lot of organizations that are going through this kind of role design process is, a lot of collection of data, a lot of loading the data into spreadsheets. I'll call it a lot of manual review, right, where they'll have people go through the spreadsheets, looking at different users and trying to make sense of what people have and what they don't. Of course, the challenge there is that as the data set grows, you get more and more users you're looking at with more and more entitlements across multiple applications. It starts to get very difficult to do that, using what I'll call the traditional spreadsheet approach. And so what we've seen a lot of people start embracing is what you're looking at here, which is more of a visual approach. So in this case, what we've done is we've loaded in users in an organization and the different entitlements that those users have. And I'm actually going to, just for the purposes of our example today, I'm going to drill down, and I'm just going to look at people who have a job title of account executive to make things a little bit easier to focus in on. But what you're looking at here is a much more powerful approach to analyzing access to potentially build out roles. So here we're actually narrowing down our search, and we're looking at just users who have a job title of account executive. And you can see here we've narrowed our search down. We're only looking at 27 entitlements here. And what we're also doing along with the visualization is we've applied some intelligence to the analysis. So we're actually applying cluster analysis to the data. So you'll notice here, as we look at these users over here across the left, these users are not in alphabetical order. And if we look at the entitlements, same thing. These entitlements aren't in alphabetical order because it doesn't necessarily make sense logically to look at access that way. Instead, what we've done is we've taken the access of this data set and we've grouped, using the cluster analysis, we've grouped like access together. So now, as a manager or somebody going in tasked with creating roles, I can look at people who should, for the most part, because of the criteria that I've selected, in this case, job title, these people should have relatively similar access. There's always exceptions, right? Maybe people are in different geographical areas, so they've got some different access there. But the idea here is that most of the access across these people should be similar, and I can see that represented here in this big cluster of access right here that I've just highlighted. So essentially, using the cluster analysis and the visualization, I was able to quickly go in and establish what 80% or 70% of this role should be, just by the fact that I've got this unique visual approach and I've done some intelligence with the data that I'm looking at. Now, what also jumps out at me are what I call the outliers, right? So I've got, for example, this person here at the top who's got radically different access than all the other people that I'm looking at. So that begs the question, why is that? Maybe they are mislabeled. Maybe they're not an account executive at all, and HR just has them labeled as that. I've run across that before. To your early example, maybe they've been with the organization for a long time and they've been over provisioned, throughout their years, and they've got access that they were given in years past that was never taken away to them as they transition from one job or one department to another. So all these things really jump out at you without having to do a lot of complex analysis from the human perspective. I'm able to go in now as a manager, for example, and easily go in and see people who are over provisioned, and we also have to look at people who might be under provisioned. For example, if account managers have this entitlement here that I've highlighted, but I see that there's two people at the bottom that don't have that, that begs the question, is this something that's really needed, or are those people getting their access from somebody else? Are they borrowing credentials? So, it's important to look at over provisioning as well as under provisioned access when you're doing your role analysis. Just a quick demo here of the power of this approach. I'm going to go ahead and hand it back over to you for the next point.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mike. Can you pass that over to me? Thank you much. And so this is at least an approach toward doing this, and obviously toward managing these roles. So let's take a look also now at the second one of these problems that we encounter often, which is basically the how exactly do organizations, generally speaking, handle contractors and third-party users in general, like if we're talking about temporary employees or anything in between. So most organizations are going to have or these two systems that you're seeing represented here, right? There's going to be a process at least in place to onboard employees that are being added to the organization into the human resource system. And this human resource system then for new employees will then add, captures the relevant information for those employees, and then obviously then hands this off to an identity and government system that will then take and, based on the roles, the titles, and everything else, will then submit or actually enable a series of entitlements within the target systems based on the roles of these new employees. Now, this process, this flow, at least, when an employee leaves a company, then in essence just happens everything in reverse, right? An HR system will actually then trigger this event where somebody has left the company. This will actually then exchange information with the IGA system, and then hopefully what will then happen is that we close off the entitlements and everyone is deprovisioned correctly. So this is the ideal scenario of what should be happening. But then when we bring in the third-party user management, unfortunately, when you're looking at things like commercial contractors, we just use this as an example. There's a compelling reason. Obviously, these aren't direct employees of the company, so they're not going to be added into the HR system directly. And oftentimes, the information for those contractors are basically captured in some completely third or a side system where there's some other process that's external to anything that you're seeing here that's actually capturing the information about those contractors. And then what ends up happening is that however that occurs and however, let's say the IT department starts granting these entitlements, in essence, these contractors are then given access to a series of entitlements that they need to perform whatever duties they're doing for the company. But this is something that's invisible to both the HR system and the IGA system itself. So what happens now when we actually kick off the process of decommissioning or at least these contractors, deprovisioning them, it really kind of doesn't happen, right? We actually take these people out of the system, and what ends up happening is that still you have a series of entitlements that are actually enabled and in a sense have absolutely no one that they're tied to. So these kind of open, so to speak, entitlements that exist within the systems then are going to be obviously big targets and create a larger attack area for anyone that's actually coming in to try to do any sort of harm within the organization itself. So this, the ability to quickly onboard and deprovision all of these third-party contractors, this is a really, really big challenge, and with most of the clients that we speak to. And Michael, I know that you had also some demos also for this too, and kind of more effective ways of potentially handling these particular options that we have here. Let me go ahead and pass this over to you so we can take a look at some more effective ways of handling these sorts of things.
So what I was going to say here regarding third-party access, there's really two camps, right? There are some organizations that we talk with who do have third parties like contractors that are in their, they have them in their HR portal, or if they've got an authoritative source where they've got all that data, they'll keep it in with regular employees and users. I would say that's probably not the norm, right? So most people would be in the other camp where they don't have third parties mixed in with their employees. And so for those organizations, a couple of things happen. One is they may have a secondary system, so they'll have their primary HR and authoritative source for employees, they may have a completely separate authoritative source for contractors. That could be anything from, just a database that they've got. They may maintain it in a flat file or an Excel spreadsheet. And then you have some organizations who don't have a place at all for those third-party contractors. And the way we would typically work with those is we would actually, we have a lot of customers who would actually use their IGA system as the source for those third parties. So in this example here, you could go in actually to the IGA system. You could add a user here directly. And again, this is not going to add it to the HR system. You could go in and specify, what type of user you're going to add. And then based on what you picked, the appropriate data fields would appear here. What department is this person in? For a contractor, you'd have an end date typically that you'd require. You'd enter all that information in, and then once you have the contractors in place, then you can manage them like you would anybody else from a governance standpoint, where you're going in and requesting access and approving access. So in this case, I've got a contractor that I've already added, and I can actually go in and look them up here in the system. I can easily see what access they currently have. I can request, I won't go through this whole example here for our demo today, but basically I could go in and I could request additional access for that person. So the idea is that, whether you're using an established authoritative source that you already have in place for your contractors, or if you choose, if you don't have a place for those individuals and you want to use your IGA system for that, you could do that. And then once those users have been picked up and added into the identity store for your IGA system, now you can manage those just like you would anybody else, which means you're always going to know what access those individuals have and when they got it, who approved it. And more importantly, in this case, when contractors leave the organization, their contracting term is up, they're no longer doing work for you, their end date comes, because you would already know what access those individuals had, it would be very easy to go in and remove that access.
Thanks, Mike. So, yeah, absolutely. So, a recommendation then will be to really handle, or at least have the IGA system really handle what it would be a third party. So let's take a look then finally at the third problem that we were addressing here also that we get oftentimes. It's a huge challenge to most organizations, and this really has to do with certifying access, right? What we're talking about here is organizations that either via regulation or basically via security practices that they have will run a certification cycle where managers are then asked to certify that the employees that are their direct reports, that they have the correct entitlements and the right accesses to the right systems. And, as with many of the other stuff, right, we see that as entitlements per employee keep rising. We start seeing, and we've seen across the industry, which is the time needed for review, obviously is going to start taking a lot more time. Quite honestly, as these cycles come in, managers, are busy doing their jobs, their particular responsibilities. And so these things are unfortunately, deprecated in terms of, their value and their use and the certification, and things keep getting kicked down the line and whatnot. And certifications not only will take a large period of time, but there's also not a lot of engagement right up front for many of the managers, because quite simply put, it's not a high order priority from their day-to-day usage. So what do we often get, in terms of, why so much time? Well, there's, besides the fact that it's often not a priority for many managers, there might be things like, managers not having the time to do it, or a really big one that we get also, which is, they have very little insight as to what these entitlements are and what they do. Unfortunately, oftentimes you're asking managers to go through and present them with a series of information that has to do, that's tied to the entitlements that are being granted to users. And they might see things that they don't recognize, or they have no idea that what you're referring to within a particular entitlement name is referring to the system that, let's say, for example, the system that the employee has to log in every day to perform his or her job, right? Some things aren't translated necessarily in ways that just a standard that, organizational managers can really handle. So oftentimes they'll have the feedback to us is like, give us a way to actually really try to figure out how to really handle these accesses, because, this is what I'm actually having to review these days, right? They're often given a series of spreadsheets with a listing of employees, and they have to go through all of these spreadsheets to then figure out, okay, these are the people that I have under my charge, and these are the systems that they have access to, and they have to kind of make sense of all of this. And again, the amount of entitlements, the amount of spreadsheets keep growing. So their basic answer or question to us is, where do I even start, and when am I going to have time to do this? So what we've kind of, what we've seen as a potential, or from our point of view, a good answer to this is like, let's look at this data set that you're seeing right here, and let's present it in such a way to the manager that it makes more sense, it's easier to manage overall, and it gives you quick access into more visibility across the board, instead of me having to put these spreadsheets side by side, for instance, that I can actually have something that gives me the entirety of this data set in just a more visual and a more appealing way and a quicker way for me to be able to review it. So, our approach is, let's make it easier by actually transforming how the data itself is presented, and actually start looking at data visualization that makes sense to managers and makes it easier for them to review. So we have a system, again, all up and running. Mike, if you have also a way to demo this very quickly here, what this sort of system kind of looks like from the point of view of what a manager would need to review as they're going through these cycles for certification within their organization.
Absolutely, absolutely. So let me go ahead. I'll share my screen out. So this is actually, we talked earlier about designing roles with visualization and cluster analysis, and how easy it was to look at the data visually and see patterns and kind of make those decisions. Well, the same thing applies here. If, let's say, I'm a manager or I'm an application owner and I'm doing, a periodic access review or certification. Let's pick a manager, and I'm reviewing my direct reports. So what I would do here is, I would just pick on the review that I wanted to look at, and then I could go in very easily and drill down. So just because we looked at account executives earlier, I'm going to do the same thing, and we're going to drill down on users who have the account executive title. And what I can do here, again, is the same data set we looked at before, except now we're not designing a role. We're actually going in and we're certifying access. So, if I was the manager of these 7 individuals, I could quickly go in, look at this information here, and determine that, yep, this is actually common access that these individuals should have. I'm going to go up very quickly, and with just a couple of clicks here, I can approve all the items here that I just selected. So you compare this to a typical access review, right, where I'm going through line by line, looking at data, and I have no real way to compare one user to another. Now, I've gone in with just a few clicks, and I've probably completed 75% of my review, and now I can take my time to focus on the access that is more likely to be at risk. For example, why is it that this user here at the top has all this extra access that nobody else has? So I can, quickly highlight that, maybe research and do my justification and come to the conclusion that, this user actually doesn't need this access. So I'm actually going to go in and I'm going to click on deny there. So as I'm going through and processing this, the choices that I've already made, turn colors. I could look at these 2 items here at the bottom and say, I'm not sure about these because these users have most of what they need, but they've got a couple of pieces of outlying access. I'm not willing to just deny it yet, but let me just indicate that I'm going to do a research on that. And so now it's very easy to go through, and the system, again, because of the visualization and the cluster analysis, it makes it easy for me to go in and identify over and under provisioned users. I can also toggle on or off the decisions that I've already made. So if I want to take away decisions that I've already made, I can just turn this off right here, and the system reclusters the data that's left over, making it easy for users to look at the data and quickly come to conclusions. Is going to provide much better results than trying to just have a manager or an application owner go through line after line after line of data. Eventually, they're going to get tired of doing it. They're going to make a mistake. They're going to, get what we call it certification fatigue. They're just going to get tired of it. And so that doesn't do the organization any good.
Absolutely. Thanks for that, Mike. And let's go through and kind of summarize a bit what it was that so far we've seen in terms of the top three problems that we're talking about here, and also what what we feel are some of the at least I don't say solutions, but at least things that you could start looking at organizationally to actually implement to actually handle these challenges that you're facing out there. So the visibility into access, really, typically the longer you're at an organization, the more access you accumulate. You want to really keep visibility into that entitlement growth, by assigning the appropriate roles and the like, and really instituting an IGA program that is going to monitor these entitlements and also, really kick back to you a visual way or at least some sort of a way that you can very quickly ascertain what exactly should be part of a central part of a role and what really is an outlier portion of this. So we really recommend having that level of visualization sophistication with it, because the truth is, handling this via a bunch of spreadsheets or potentially just having trying to look at what already existed, for instance, for a previous user is probably not the best way to go. You need to be able to look at this more thoroughly and analyze it at that higher level. The second part of this is also the third-party user management. When we're talking about the Wild West when it comes to managing contractors, we know that obviously that because of the way many organizations handle this really exists outside of the HR system proper in most organizations, and we really recommend really getting this information or information pertaining to contractors into the IGA program and suite. And that way, being able to then handle it centrally from that location and be able to provision and deprovision according to what's needed via that the IGA suite itself. And then last but not least, what Michael just alluded to here is as we're going through this, the certifying access also really use the power of cluster analysis in general to make things easier for the reviews, give them good tools to be able to handle this, provide visualizations, and really institute ways in which data itself can actually be presented as easily and effectively toward users that have to go through tons and tons of this data, so that you can actually run the certification cycles and run them more often and obviously be more effective and be more secure as a result of it. So this concludes at least the part of that we have here for the challenges that we see most often across organizations. I'd like to take a few minutes here then to address some of the questions that have come in at this point via our chat room. Okay, so we will wrap it up here. For those of you that have either submitted questions before, we can get back to you also. We don't see any pressing questions at this point, so I thank you very much for your time today and hope that you've found this information useful. Take care.